Good morning. If you have your Bibles, turn to Nehemiah chapter 10. And we're going to be talking more about the covenant in action. Covenants are kind of a word that is kind of somewhat of an antiquated word. We don't really use a whole lot of those today unless you've been around church. You probably haven't heard much of that, right? If there's two people and they're going into some kind of agreement with one another, they're not saying they're going into a covenant with each other. They usually say they're going into some kind of contract. So some of you have started businesses or had some sort of interaction with a lawyer of some kind. You know, you probably had some sort of contract. And if you bought your home, there's a contract. There's all kinds of stuff that requires contracts. And in those contracts, there's obligations. You are saying to the other party that you are going to keep your end of the bargain, and they're going to keep their end of the bargain. And if you do not keep your end of the bargain, the contract is terminated, and you could even bring legal help in there to make sure that the other party is fulfilling their end of the bargain. And so what you've got is more of it's a thing that we need to kind of get along throughout just our relationships with other people. It's necessary. Now, unfortunately it's necessary, but it's still necessary. However, in a covenant, it's much deeper and more powerful than just a typical contract that you think of. Some of you, if you're married, you've entered into a marriage covenant. Those of you who are not married, thinking about that one day, marriage and what that looks like in a sense of a covenant. And in the Old Testament, the way they did covenants was kind of gruesome, but at the same time, it had a pretty powerful effect. And you understand what the meaning of it. They'd take an animal, and they'd chop it up, and they'd put like a piece over here, and they'd put another piece over here, and then they would walk in between the dead parts of the animal. And both parties would do it. They'd walk between both sides of it, come out, and what they were saying is, if I do not fulfill my end here, what has happened to this animal will happen to me. That's how serious I'm taking this. And often, those who were kings, conquered kings, would go into a country and they would conquer that area, but they would say, look, we just came in and we're the conquering nation, but we want to protect you. We'll keep you safe. We'll make sure that you thrive and prosper here. I mean, you're a part of our kingdom now. So you send us your sons to battle when we have to go to battle, and what we'll do is we'll go in and we'll make sure that we protect you. And so the king would enter into the people, and they would walk through this, and of course you can't hold a king to that because he's human. You know, he's got all the power. But the people, they're kind of, okay, we're in this, we're in this covenant deal. Now, the only time in any ancient Near East that you've got anywhere of this idea of covenant, not one of those places other than with Israel do you ever see God entering into a covenant with the people. Where God himself enters into a covenant with the people and says, I am with you, I'm going to faithfully take care of you and protect you and be with you. That you don't have to fear anything from man because I am with you. It's unheard of. And you even see this in the incarnation with Jesus in the gospel, that Jesus takes on human flesh and he becomes a baby and learns how to talk and he cries and he's doing all the things that babies do, and he grows up and he's learning how to walk. And just thinking that the Son of God is taking on the form of human, and he's out of them by addition, that this is who he is. It's amazing, very humbling thing, but at the same time you see that God in his love for us goes after us and comes after us and enters into a covenant with us. And so this idea of a covenant, we've been talking about it, but I just want to bring that up because that's what we're going to be talking about today, is this idea of a covenant in action. The idea that because of this covenant, now the beauty of the gospel is that Jesus fulfills that obligation for us. We realize, if I were to ask each one of you, how perfect of a life do you live? And if I saw a hand up, I'd know you were lying, right? Because every single one of us have our faults, we have our flaws, we have our weaknesses, we have our sins, we have those things that beset us. And when we look at ourselves, we see how guilty that we are before a holy and righteous and just God. And so when we go to meet our end of the covenant, we fail, right? We fail. We know that. We fail at meeting our obligations to the covenant. However, Jesus died on the cross for our sins, lived a perfectly righteous life, so that he fulfilled the obligations of the covenant for us. Where he goes, I'm taking my righteousness and I live perfectly, and this is going to go on your account. So if we believe in Jesus, we have his righteousness there, and our obligations to the covenant have been met and have been fulfilled. Now, because of that, That doesn't mean that we are just to live a Christian life of going, oh yeah, I'm saved and I'm good, right? Because of the covenant that we are still a part of, even though Jesus has fulfilled it, we are still to live to follow after those obligations that God has placed in this relationship with us. That's our goal as a Christian, a follower of Christ. And sometimes people, they mistake this. When you go and you tell them about grace, that Jesus Christ has paid the price for our sin, what we mean by that is that when we fail, it's not like we're done, because it's already been taken care of with Jesus. But because of Jesus, it allows us to live in this relationship with him that is very much a relationship so we can live for him. Your life and my life are not our own. One of the things that we see, unfortunately, in this culture, and this is just not just our culture and today, this is humanity, right? That we think that our lives are our own, and every decision that we make is something in which benefits us. So if you go and get a job, or you go find a house, or whatever it is, everything you ask, and I'm not saying these are necessarily bad things, but thinking of it in this way, everything is about us. We are the makers of our own destiny. Even the American dream. You pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. You work hard enough. You can get to the place where you want to be, and life is great. And in that mentality, we become gods of our own universe, where everything we do is something that makes us happy, it makes us comfortable, it makes us secure. If we don't feel good, we don't do it. But in this covenant with God, we are not our own. We belong to the Lord. And because of that, we want to live for him. We live to him. Now, this may seem like some people, they go, that seems like slavery. It seems like a terrible thing. We enter into covenant relationships all the time. Again, with marriage. My wife, I love her. And when I do things that she loves, I don't see that as slavery. If you love somebody, you don't do something for them because you see that as slavery. You do that for them because you love them, right? It's not a bad thing. It's not a negative thing, but there is a covenant relationship there that we've said to death do us part, that we're in this for the rest of our lives. We're in it for the long haul. And in those covenant relationships, those are not seen as negative, right? We see those, oh yeah, that's sweet, that's nice, that's good. In the same way with the Lord. The Lord has come after us. He's provided for us. He's taken care of us. He has done so many amazing things for us. He has provided in the sense of that covenant, but there are obligations in which we are to fulfill. Our life is not our own. And once we miss that, once you start missing that thinking that our life is our own, you start getting into all kinds of messed up theology. You start to get messed up just personal idols in your life. That's when things that aren't supposed to be idols become idols. Good things in your life, you see your relationships in wrong, your spouses, your kids, you see friendships in wrong lights. All of a sudden you start looking at these things and think, these things are here to make me happy, versus how can I glorify God in the midst of these? My relationship with God, how can I make him more famous as a result of how I work in this environment, in this relationship? And so in Nehemiah chapter 10, we're going to start talking this idea of covenant in action. Verse 1, it talks about on the seals are the name of Nehemiah the governor, son of Hakaliah, and then he goes into a whole bunch of other names. These are families. These are, some of these talks about priests. These are people that are on this seal of this covenant. And so in the last two chapters, you've got this idea of reaffirming the covenant. And they didn't have a new covenant with God. It wasn't like, they're like, okay, God, we broke that. Now let's set up a new one. They're reaffirming the obligations that they already were supposed to be keeping, but they had neglected to keep. So if you think of it like this. Think about in a marriage. Let's say there is a marriage, and in that, you've got, it's just a bad week. Have not been a good spouse, been a good husband, been a good wife, just not done a good job at keeping just loving your wife or loving your husband the way that you should biblically. Well, you're no longer married in that sense, but you go, man, I'm sorry. I need to kind of continue just to kind of work at this, and I'm sorry for being a jerk. I'm sorry for being selfish. I'm sorry for being proud, whatever it may be. God has always been faithful to the Israel people. Continually came after them. And as they continued to rebel against him, and they did all kinds of stuff. They're like, okay, God, yeah, we're in this covenant with you, but now we're gonna over here and we're gonna make this little idol and make this little statue, and then we're gonna worship it. And not only that, but there's this really kind of crazy practice of the other cultures around where they would have child sacrifices. Yeah, we're gonna sacrifice our children to these little statues. Now, God, who has done all these things, and if you want to look back in chapter 9, at the very beginning, to see, just like as Nehemiah is recollecting through Israel's history, all the things that God did to provide for them. I mean, even in the wilderness, they didn't have food, and God's like, okay, you need some food? Here's some food on the ground. Let me rain it from heaven. Boom. You wake up and there's bread on the ground. You're like, whoa, there's food for me to eat, and I'm in the wilderness, and we don't have any food. There's nothing to eat. You imagine going down to like in the middle of the desert in Death Valley in California. Have you ever been there? And it's just like there's nothing out there. I remember we were going across country with some buddies back when I was right after college, and we're going across, and we're like trying to find places to stop, and you get nervous because you're like, man, I should have stopped at the last gas station, but I didn't, and now I'm not sure if I'm going to make it because there's nothing out here. And so you're like, man, how can people even live out here? But the children of Israel, they lived in the desert. And God put bread on the ground for them, and they're thirsty. So he's like, okay, you're thirsty? Just go to that rock, and Moses, just take your stick, and you're just going to tap it, and the water's going to come out. Water comes out of rocks that they're drinking out of. Like, this is the kind of way that God's providing for the people. And yet the people go and they make statues, and they worship them. You think this is just who we are as human beings. God provides time and time again, and we go after other things. And yet God still loves us and keeps that covenant with us as a faithful covenant keeper because of Jesus. All because of Christ. It's such an amazing thing of being a follower of Jesus. And this is the people here now reaffirming that. God, we've messed up. We screwed up. We're sealing this as a reaffirmation of what you've already done in our lives and what we're saying we're going to do to you. And so they are putting their names on the list here. Several reasons why they do this. One, this is just for people to know. Like, if you write your name on something, you're saying something by that. Like, I'm serious about this. I'm serious about it. Going back to the idea of weddings and marriage, you get these rings, right, when you get married. And some, if you're guys tend to lose these more than women do for some reason. We're just really bad at it. I broke one playing dodgeball, my first one. So, you do all kinds of things, right, losing these things. But anyways, they're important. Because what they say is that this is a sign of the covenant I made with my wife. That we're married and we're together forever. That's the point of that. And that I'm not ashamed of it. And so we're saying to the world, we belong to each other. We say in that there's also accountability for the people. The people are writing their names down so that if you screw up again, you miss something on the covenant that you're supposed to keep your obligations, you got your name written down somewhere. And it's like, hey, you remember that thing you signed 5 years ago? Like, you're not keeping your end of the covenant here. We need to get back on this. We are saying that this is a serious thing, and we mean business by what we're doing here. So this is an important thing for us. I think as we understand this in our lives, here's just some practical application for us in the sense of our covenant with the Lord. As a follower of Jesus Christ, again, Jesus fulfills our end of those obligations, right? But in that, we need to be held accountable for each other. And accountability is not a bad thing, but for whatever reason, that's kind of a scary thing. Think of accountability, and you go, oh man, accountability, that seems like judgmental or whatever else. Not in a Christian way that we're supposed to do it. Because in the way that we're supposed to do this, we have nothing to prove with each other. Because we realize with everybody that we've all been saved by grace and that none of us have achieved this on our own. Everything's been given because of Jesus. We have grace. It's all Him. So you can't look at somebody else and go, man, I'm doing better than you. No, you're not. Because you're a sinner just like they are. And you both have this depraved nature we're fighting against that God has redeemed and will be completely redeemed upon glory. But we're still fighting. Every single day we're fighting. And we need each other for accountability. You need people. And I think one of the hard parts for us in American Christianity is that we have this idea of this kind of single, lone man, person thing where we're like, I can handle this on my own. I like that, personally, just being honest with you and sharing with you. I love to do things on my own. I just like the feeling of it. I like to see a task and realize, like, envision how to do it and take care of it. I just enjoy it, just personally. And I don't know, maybe you can relate to that, about doing that. And even when it comes to our Christian life, that may be the way that you see yourself. Like, I can take care of this on my own. I don't need anybody else around me. I don't need anybody seeing this side of my life. I can do this on my own. But biblically, this was a covenant community. Like, Israel was doing this together as a nation. They were signing these documents so they could all see each other's names on this list and say, hey, we're doing this together and we're all holding each other accountable to this. It's not a bad thing. It's a good thing. Think about like soldiers in battle. And as they're going off in battle, and they have teams, and you think guys that are going off into all kinds of places all across the world, and they're going into hard places, they need each other. Without each other, they die. I mean, they have to depend upon one another to take care of them and protect them and look out for each other. In the same way, as a covenant community, we're supposed to do the same for each other. And so in redemption, one way we do that is through membership. You know, we ask people, hey, think through this. If this is something you'd like to be a part of. And again, someone can still be a follower of Jesus Christ and not be a member of Redemption Church. I totally get that. Membership of Redemption Church is not equal salvation. Make sure you understand that. We're clear on that. But what we are saying under that is that if someone's a follower of Jesus, you need a place where you can be accountable with other people. And the way that we do that at Redemption is through membership. You know, this isn't a church for everybody, and we tell people all the time, you know, if this isn't the church for you, that's okay. Get plugged in somewhere. Find your place, find a church to get a part of, find some people to do life with that are going to hold you accountable, that you're going to be centered around the gospel of Jesus together, and you're going to do this life together. That's the point of the idea of the church. It's what it's supposed to be about. It's not just a gathering place for us to have some kind of country club mentality. We're here to do this life together. That's the goal. And if it's not about us. We care less about us. It's about glorifying the Lord. So whether it's here or whether it's somewhere else, it's getting plugged in, being a part of a body. I remember when I was in college, and my freshman year, and I just couldn't get connected, just kind of go around, coming from kind of a couple different churches, and just never felt at home. Finally got part of a body there, but I just remember just feeling so just kind of out of place, and kind of went through a period of depression. Long story there. God brought me out throughout, just out of that, through a group of believers that I could share life with and do it together. You're not meant to do this thing by yourself. We're not made for that. And talk about some of the people, the guys who are like, even the guys who are out in the middle of the woods somewhere, and they've got their old cabins, and they're like off the land, and you could tell they just love it. They love being out there by themselves. Even those guys. I remember watching this interview, this guy, he was like in Alaska or somewhere, and he's just out in there by himself, and he's like, you know, I think in fact he had made himself into a lizard. I don't know, it was really an odd story, but he's like, I'm just looking for somebody. I'm just looking for someone to be married to, and, you know, just so I can not be so lonely. Even I get a little bit lonely out here. I was thinking, this guy who loves to be out by himself off the land, Mr. Lizard Man, and Mr. Lizard Man needs a wife, you know, like he's lonely. And I think for us as people, we're just built that way. God has made us and designed us that way. We need each other. And under an accountable community, not a judgmental community, but a community that's there to follow Christ together, to pursue Jesus together. That's what it's meant to be. And that's what the point of this, talking about here, membership in the covenant. Secondly, we see obligations of the covenant. Look down to verse 28. The rest of the people, the priests, the Levites, the gatekeepers, the singers, the temple servants, and all who have separated themselves from the peoples of the lands to the law of God, their wives, their sons, their daughters, all who have knowledge and understanding, join with their brothers, their nobles, and enter into a curse and an oath to walk in God's law that was given by Moses, the servant of God, and to observe and do all the commandments of the Lord our God and his rules and his statutes. We will not give our daughters to the peoples of the land or take their daughters for our sons. And if the peoples of the land bring in goods or any grain on the Sabbath to sell, we will not buy from them on the Sabbath or on a holy day. And we will forego the crops of the seventh year and the exaction of every debt. So you've got here now the people are kind of going back to their obligations. These are some things that they had neglected while they were wandering around and had not been following after Christ in time of exile. And these are things that God had confronted them with. Some of the sins in which that they had fallen to, easily fallen prey to. And you could probably think personally, there are certain things that you are more tempted to than probably other people are. Maybe they're shared in that sense. There are certain temptations that tend to hit you and tend to hit me in different ways. Now, and thinking through that, here's a couple of the ones that the people were dealing with. We see, first of all, I think in verse 28, and he kind of hits this another one. One of the struggles that they were having with Israel is that they were marrying those who were not a part of the covenant community. They were marrying those that were unbelievers. So Israel was finding, sons were finding their wives, and outside of the covenant community. The wives were finding husbands outside of the covenant community. And they're saying, okay, we got to stop doing this. Like we need to have believers as spouses. This is an important part of our marriage, it's an important part of our covenant. So they made a commitment there in that sense. Now, we've talked this a couple times, but I always just feel like it's important to stress this, just especially when dealing with something like this. I think in this, when you hear about Israel and what they say, the importance of not marrying someone who's an unbeliever, we also see in New Testament, you're dealing with people who became Christians and all kinds of stuff happen. In the middle of that, sometimes you in Christians, I'm going to encourage you, some of you who may say, well, my spouse is not a believer, or what do I do here? What do I do here? If your spouse is not a believer, you stay with that person and you love them as Jesus told you to love them, and through your testimony with them, maybe they would become a follower of Christ. And we see that in the New Testament. He's not saying here, you got to be careful we take this as a prescriptive for us today, and the New Testament has made it clear what we do in a case like that. And so in the middle of that, you love your spouse. This is not saying that you get a divorce from them. Who you're married to right now, you love them in the sense of what God has put before them in the way that you're supposed to. Loving them unconditionally, loving the way that Jesus has loved you. You go after them. You faithfully serve them in a sacrificially and selfless way. And in praying for them every single day that they would become a follower of Jesus. That's the point of some of these things you see in the New Testament, and that's not what we're talking about here today. But this is one of the things they were struggling with, this idea of intermarrying with outside believers, unbelievers. They were struggling with that, and they're saying, we're not going to do this anymore. You see that a couple other things that they're going to do. They're going to decide to follow the commandments of the Lord. So God has given them commandments. They're supposed to follow those and obey those. They're making commitment to obey those commandments. Take the 10 Commandments. And I don't know if you know them, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. Well, that's the summation of them. But the first commandment, you shall have no other gods before me. Second, no other graven images. It talks about bearing false witness, obeying parents, obeying the Sabbath. All these different things, not coveting, not killing, murdering, adultery, all these different things. They're supposed to obey those commandments. They're making commitment to follow those commandments. It says on there, also they will obey the Sabbath and utilize that time for a time of worship. To actually follow this idea of Sabbath. These are the things in the Old Testament law that they were told to do, commanded to do, put in place to do. And so as we kind of take this into a New Testament context, again, just in thinking prescriptively, I think these things are important, but I think also that's not said here is that we need to understand those things in which we fall and fail in all the time. So for us as a covenant community, we have obligations to keep in following after the law of the Lord. The law of the Lord is not a bad thing. Sometimes we so diminish, we so want to lift up grace, the grace of Christ, that in the middle of explaining the grace of Christ that we forget how important the law still is to us. Now, in the law, we realize what? That we're sinners, that we can't keep it. We've seen that. As we said earlier, as you see the law and you see yourself, you are a sinner, I'm a sinner, we have fallen short of the law. That's why we need grace. Jesus fulfills all of it, 100%. It's not like we give part and Jesus gives part. Jesus does everything 100%, fulfills our obligations to the covenant. All Jesus, 100%. But because of that, because of his love for us, we still want to follow after him. And the law shows us the things that God is glorified in, that reveals his heart, and also the things that God is hurt by, our actions and the sins in which we commit. Now, when we talk Old Testament to New Testament, we've talked about this before, you can think of, well, Bobby, one of the things that we see in the Old Testament, what about all these things about like not eating shellfish and mixing your fibers and all these other things? Like, is God saying that, like, we don't do that anymore? Why not? Here's just a simple way you can kind of look at now I don't mean to be too reductionistic here, but it's a simple way for you to understand Old Testament law. There's 3 different types of law you see in the Old Testament. One, sacrificial law. One is ceremonial law. One is God's universal law. Sacrificial law are all those things that are about holiness. You see in there about shellfish and fibers. The people lived differently, separated themselves from those outside of their community to be set apart and be holy. So that was a part for them as a physical example and demonstration of what God was doing to their people so that they can be set apart from the rest of the people around them. So they could be a priest to the nations, and they could share the good news of God to the nations and do all those things in which they were supposed to do. That was one part. In Christ, Jesus has made us holy. He's written the law of God in our hearts. He said, the Bible says he circumcised our hearts, where the men had to be circumcised at a few days old, 7, 8 days old. Now God circumcised our hearts so that the actual ceremonial law, we see that holiness is done to the individual, right? We've been made holy because of Jesus. Jesus makes us holy. And so the shellfish and those kinds of things, we don't do these things to kind of be a physical demonstration any longer. We have this by our conduct, as Timothy talks about, our conduct, our faith, our following after Christ. Secondly, you saw a law that governed the people. So Israel had a theocracy. That means God ruled the people, and he gave them all these laws. What do you do when you're in a fight with a guy and this happens and your wife hits the guy below the belt? This is part of the Old Testament law. There's a caveat in there about that. It tells you what to do. Now, we as followers of Jesus Christ in this world, we are a nation of exiles. And what I mean by that is that the church is all across the world, all the kinds of different geographies, different governments, different places. And in that, the church is all over. And so we don't have a theocracy. In Romans, we're told to obey the governor and obey the government. And our job is to follow the rules of the land as long as they don't violate our conscience of what we're supposed to do as followers of Jesus. And so those theocratic laws, and then you have God's universal laws, the things that represent God's heart. This is where he says things like don't commit adultery, don't worship other gods, don't do all these other things. And in that, those are good things for us to follow, the obligations to follow after Jesus. And so for us, each one of us struggle in so many different areas when it comes to following after Christ, following the law of the Lord. In that, we don't have to feel the guilt and pain from being punished by the law anymore because we've been justified in Christ, but we are to live and obey the law and follow after the Lord in that because it glorifies his name. It's like if you think about, again, it's a kid and, if you have children in the room and sometimes your kids will obey you because they see the look on your face, like you've given them the look. And they're like, if I push Dad one more step, I'm going to be put in my room, or I'm getting a spanking or whatever it is. You're like, here it comes. I'm going to be punished by this. And they see that look in your face, like, I don't want to do it. Sometimes we look at God that way in the sense like, okay, if I'm following Jesus, am I doing what I'm supposed to do? Is God happy with me? It's not about that. We realize we can't make him happy by our actions because we fail. It's only through Jesus Christ. But we live for the law of the Lord because it glorifies God. We love his law. You can love God's law because it glorifies his name. I don't need to camp out too much more of that, but we do it for other reasons. Following after Jesus for other reasons. Thirdly, sacrificial worship. Let's look at verse 32. We also take on ourselves the obligation to give yearly a third part of a shekel for the service of the house of our God. For the showbread, the regular grain offering, the regular burnt offering, the Sabbaths, the moons, the appointed feasts, the holy things, and the sin offerings to make atonement for Israel, and for all the work of the house of our God. We, the priests, the Levites, and the people have likewise cast lots for the wood offering, to bring it into the house of our God according to our fathers' houses at times appointed, year by year, to burn on the altar of the Lord our God, as it is written in the law. We obligate ourselves to bring the first fruits of our ground and the first fruits of all fruit of every tree year by year to the house of the Lord. Also to bring to the house of our God, to the priest who minister in the house of our God, the firstborn of our sons and of our cattle, as it is written in the law, and the firstborn of our herds and our flocks. And to bring the first of our dough and your contributions, the fruit of every tree, the wine and the oil to the priest, to the chambers of the house of our God, and to bring the Levites the tithes from the ground. For it is the Levites who collect the tithes in all of our towns where we labor. And the priest, the son of Aaron, shall be with the Levites when the Levites receive the tithes. And the Levites shall bring up the tithe of the tithes to the house of our God, to the chambers of the storehouse. For the people of Israel and the sons of Levi shall bring the contribution of grain, wine, and oil to the chambers where the vessels of the sanctuary are, as well as the priests who minister and the gatekeepers and the singers. We will not neglect the house of our God. Sacrificial worship. In this section, you see here that the people are giving of themselves. They're giving, you see the third part of every shekel. This is, again, shekels. We don't have shekels today, but this is a part of currency back in these times. They gave the first fruits of their ground, first fruits of every tree, the first of their livestock, their dough, and we'll talk in a second. There's a really cool thing about the sons part, but I want to get ahead of myself. And it talks about the tithes from the ground. In the very end, it says, we will not neglect the house of our God. All of this, now of course, what had happened in Israel, in Jerusalem, they had just rebuilt the temple. This is where they can make atonement for sin, burnt offerings. They can make wood offerings. All this is going on. And so it takes money to get this thing off the ground, like to bring in all the things in which they had. They cost supplies. There was wood. They had animals they were bringing in. They had vessels. There were incense. There was all kinds of things that were going on throughout, in a sense, of the temple. And all this was done for the glorification of God and the worship of His name, and to make atonement for sin and the different offerings that were going on in the temple. It's a big thing that's going on here. And so where does all that come from? Like, it just doesn't appear off the ground. Like, okay, here it is. Let's go. Let's do it. The people gave sacrificially. Why did they do that? Why would they give sacrificially to the work of the Lord? Because it was all about Him. It was all about God. Everything in which they had, they did not see it as their own. They shouldn't have seen it as their own. But the way that this was meant to be is that none of this is ours to begin with. Because none of it is ours, we want to give the first of it to be as a sense of thanks and worship to the Lord. And so you see all the different things in which they gave, right? All the things that we just talked about. It's a really cool thing I want to share with you guys, and it talks about this, I think, in verse 36. It says, also to bring to the house of our God, to the priests who minister in the house of our God, the firstborn of our sons and of our cattle. Okay, we talked about this a second ago. Israel didn't do children worship or sacrifice their kids like some of the other pagan nations around them. But what this is an allusion to is back to, if you look in Exodus 13, you can kind of see towards the end of that, I think in verse 13 or 14, kind of talks more about this idea. But when the children of Israel were back in Egypt, anybody see The Prince of Egypt? Kids movie about Moses and all that happened there. Old movie. It was back when I was a kid. Okay, so in that movie you have, or even the Charlton Heston movie, the Ten Commandments. They used to show it like I don't know if they still do it, like on Good Friday, they show it sometimes. And it's like about Moses leading the people out of Egypt and all that happens there. And the 10 plagues, and they hit Egypt. And all that, this devastation and destruction. God brings locusts and darkness, and He's trying to send a message to Pharaoh, and it's, let my people go. They need to let them go out of slavery and let them leave Egypt. Well, Pharaoh's got a stubborn, hardened heart, and he's not going to let those people go. So finally, it all comes down to the 10th plague, and the 10th plague is the taking of firstborn sons. And what God says to Israel and to Egypt. This plague actually affected both. And He says, I will take, the angel of death is going to come through at night, and it's going to take every firstborn son. But if you would sacrifice an unblemished lamb, and you take the blood of that lamb and you put it on the doorpost of your house, the angel of death will pass over. Won't take your son, but you can have life. In that, of course, many of the Israelites listened and obeyed, Egyptians did not. Angel of death comes through, takes out firstborn sons. Sure, that night was a night that would have been very traumatic and very tough and very hard. But in that, God was trying to tell the people something very important, that everything we have, including our kids, don't belong to us, but they're the Lord's. And in that, there's a beautiful picture of the gospel in that. That as sinners, we deserve death. We deserve it. It's not something that God is unjustly doing to us. We deserve death. We deserve destruction. But in the middle of that, God has provided a way out through his son Jesus. That Jesus paid the price for our sin, and through him, we can have forgiveness and eternal life. And so this year, what they were supposed to do is go back to the temple, and when they had their firstborn sons, they would go and they would take 5 shekels and pay the price for their sons. Now, this was in a ceremonial kind of thing, in the sense that they were trying to bring illusion back to what God had done in Egypt. God had protected them, that God had kept them safe and provided even for the safety of their children. I don't know about you guys who are parents in the room. Some of you guys are not. If you're parents in the room and you know just the strain of being a parent and the joy, it's a joy and a love, but it's also it's scary. Because you look around at all the hard, crazy things that can happen to your kids in this world, and it can make you lose sleep at night, and it can be so tough. But in the middle of that, knowing that even our children belong to the Lord, and that as parents who love our kids, who want the best for our kids, that they're ultimately his. We can't hold on to them any better than God can. You know, sometimes we like to grab them. We're like, I'm going to protect you, and I'm not going to let anything happen to you. You don't have that kind of power. We think we do. I think I do, but I don't. You don't. God does, and they're his. Everything that we have in this world ultimately belongs to God. Everything that he allows to happen is allowed by his hand. And in the middle of that, all of our possessions, all of our kids, all of our families, all of our relationships, our jobs, everything that we hold so near and dear ultimately belongs to the Lord. And in the middle of that, we can't hold on to it so tight where we think we've got something with that. It's all God's. It's all the Lord's. And so the people gave freely of it, first fruits, as a symbol of worship to God. God, take it. It's yours. Take these things, because ultimately it's all yours to begin with. And we want to worship you and thank you for your provision in this. And you think about, and again, this is not in a sense to say you need to give money, because that's not the whole point of what this is trying to say. But I think when we understand of the money in which we make, and realize that the jobs that we have is all provided by the Lord, it's not that hard to give up part of our portions of our income to do things for the Lord. It's not that crazy when you really think about it. It all belongs to God. We're talking even this week, we're planning through for redemption and kind of thinking through what our yearly budget's going to be, and trying to think through that, and we're trying to look through all the different things that we're trying to do, things in the community, and everything. It costs money. Rent here at the theater, and thankfully, the generosity of those outside of our church that have been given for us as a church plant, and those of you inside our church have been given the generosity there, it pays for the things that we do. And as people give generously, that helps take care of those things. And again, if you don't give, we're not keeping tabs on that. Nobody has any idea of what's going on there. Our contribution secretary doesn't even go to this church just so that we would not have any knowledge of that, because I don't ever want to be something where, as pastors, we have no idea who gives and who doesn't. And that's intentional, because we don't want it to be some kind of guilt thing, where we're putting on people to say who gives and who doesn't give. It's not important, right? It's about your relationship with the Lord. That's what we care about. That's what we're trying to foster and encourage. But in the middle of that people's generosity, because of their first fruits of their income going, it helps take care of what goes on here at the church. It helps take care of our block parties in the summer, everything else that we do, and plans, and we're praying through what God wants us to do as a church, and we encourage our members, vote on that yearly or budget, saying this is what we feel like God is placing us to do. We trust you in that. And we want our church to be a church that glorifies the Lord in that. And so in the middle of that, the first fruits of offerings that are given go towards the taking care of the mission of the Lord, all of it. And just everything that we have. And I think, and there's so many different things that are good to give to. I mean, there's many ministries. There's all kinds of missionaries that are all overseas that rely on income, and that giving to those people, those are good things to give to. Those who are impoverished, who don't have needs. I mean, we do Operation Christmas Child, we talked about, because we want to give to kids who have needs. We want to take care of those things. Those are all things above and beyond that, you go, hey, we're just going to take this box to the store, and we're going to go fill it up with some things and give it to some kids who don't have. And that's good. We were talking about this earlier today, and Lindsay took the kids to the store, and they're filling up boxes for Operation Christmas Child. And my son, he's 2, has a hard time getting. He's 2-year-old. I mean, I have a hard time, and I'm 32, giving away my stuff. Of course, my 2-year-old's going to have a tough time with that. And so we're going to the store, and trying to find stuff to put into their boxes, and filling up these boxes of stuff to give to kids who have needs. And my son's like, oh, that's for Trey? No, that's not for Trey. That's for the kid who needs. He needs it. That's for Trey. I want to play with that. No, that's not. You don't get to play with that. It's for somebody else. I think my 2-year-old son, I see myself in, right? We see ourselves in humanity and in our sense of wanting to hold on to what we think that is ours. But it's not. None of it is. Our time sometimes is more precious than money. Think of all the things that I do with my time. Why do we hold back and go like, God, you get the leftovers. I'm going to give you the leftovers of my time. If I have time, I'll do this for you. If I have time, if I have the money, if I have the resources, I'll do this for you. He's an afterthought. He's a leftover. Like, don't make God your leftovers. He should be our first, right? He should be everything. He should be the best of the best. That's what it was in Israel. It was the best of the best. We've talked this before. Some people go, oh, yeah, he talks about here, he says tithe, so it must be just 10%. Actually, tithe was only one of the things he mentions here. Tithe is just like not even bare minimum for Israel. I mean, they were given, that was just the first fruits. They gave a third of every shekel once a year. Back in Exodus, that was a half of every shekel. Sometimes some people think it's just because of the way they did the money system in Persia. Talking about here, they gave their animals, the first of the trees, grain, wine, all these different things they gave. And above and beyond, they even gave free will offerings on top of that. God deserves everything. And this is not just a money thing. He deserves all of us, right? Everything. Everything that we have, he deserves. He deserves the best. Is God your priority in your worship of your life, or is he just a leftover? If he's just a leftover, he's not what you worship. If God is just a leftover, he's not what you worship. We want to worship God because he's the Lord who's created heavens and the earth, and everything is his. All glory belongs to him. All honor, all power, all is all his. We do this as a covenant community, living after the law, loving the law of the Lord, giving to the Lord freely, not out of obligation or guilt. Like we said, we don't have to do that any longer because of Christ. Christ has fulfilled that. We give because we want to. We live and love God because we want to. There's so many things we love to do. We love to do on our weekends. We love to do in our time. And is it, again, not to go too far into that, and we're going to get legalistic or anything here, but I think there's so many things that I just think personally that I do first before the Lord. And the Lord's just second. It's like this just not how it's supposed to be. And as followers of Jesus Christ, is the Lord primary in your life? Does he get the best of you? Or is he just a leftover?